World War II ended 80 years ago, but its shadow, long and cold, still shapes the very foundation of our world. The death toll is mind-boggling, 70 to 85 million people, 3% of the entire global population at the time, but these aren't just abstract statistics. Behind every single number is a human life cut short, a future that never was, a permanent void in someone's family. Back then, it wasn't just buildings that collapsed. The old world order came crashing down. From the ash and steel, new superpowers rose. For the first time in history, genocide was formally condemned as a crime. And on the rubble of empires, a fragile framework of new international rules was assembled. The very rules we still live by today. This journey isn't just a chronicle of battles. It's an investigation into the long-term consequences. Consequences that we, often without realizing it, feel in our own lives. How do you even comprehend 85 million? That's more than the entire current population of France, Austria, and Belgium combined. Whole nations erased from the demographic map. But the true horror of that war lies elsewhere. For the first time in history, the number of civilian dead didn't just match military casualties, it horrifically surpassed them. The bombing of cities, famine, disease, the systematic destruction of entire peoples in death camps, war ceased to be just a matter for armies. It came knocking on every door. Entire generations were wiped out. In the Soviet Union, 1 in every 7 people died. In Poland, 1 in 5. And in Germany, the men who returned from the front weren't heroes. They were broken. And their country was rebuilt from the ruins by the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. This was a war against everyone. And what was left for those who survived? A deep, unspoken grief. A silence they carried within them for decades. A pain they, without wanting to, passed on to their children and even their grandchildren. Psychologists call this transgenerational trauma. Fear, hypervigilance, an inability to show emotion, a sense of guilt just for being alive. The echoes of those years still resonate in the family stories of millions. From Berlin to Moscow, from London to Tokyo. My father never spoke about the war, not a word. But there were unspoken rules in our house. You finish everything on your plate. And you never, ever throw old things away. It might be useful, he'd say, even though that was never supposed to happen again. My grandmother always cooked enough to feed an army. Mom, why so much? I'd ask. She'd just shrug and say, what if there's hunger? She lived to be 90, and that what if never left her, not for a single day. That invisible shadow is inside us, in our caution, in our memory, in how we raise our own children. But the war left behind more than just invisible scars on the human psyche. It radically redrew the world's political map, and on its ruins, a new, even more surreal and dangerous confrontation began almost immediately. The world split in two, and so began the long, cold shadow of World War II, an era that determined everything, from the space race to a culture of fear and the balance of nuclear terror. But that's a story for the next chapter. When the guns finally fell silent, both victors and the defeated were met with a new, terrifying landscape. Not battlefields, total devastation. Europe and Asia lay in rubble. Germany's industry was 80% destroyed. Japanese cities, scorched by relentless firebombing, had turned into fields of ash. More than 40 million Europeans were left homeless. In this world, there were no winners in any traditional sense. There was only the loser, human civilization itself, thrown decades backward. Among the ruins wandered millions who had lost everything. They were called displaced persons, former concentration camp prisoners, forced laborers, refugees, soldiers who returned to find no home waiting for them. camps became their new, if only temporary, reality. And humanity now faced a simple, terrifying question. How do you rebuild a society that's been shattered to its core? The answer from the West came in the form of the Marshall Plan. From 1948 to 1952, the United States poured an unprecedented $13 billion into Western Europe, more than $150 billion in today's money. It wasn't charity, it was a strategic investment. The goal: build stable, prosperous democracies that could resist Soviet influence, and it worked. Participating economies grew 5 to 8% annually. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild factories, it rebuilt hope, paving the way for a consumer society and a strong middle class. But a united Europe never materialized. Germany's fate became a symbol of a new divide. The decisions of the 1945 Potsdam Conference split the country into occupation zones. What began as a temporary administrative measure quickly hardened into a border between two worlds. The Soviet-controlled East and the Marshall Plan-driven West became two different Germanys. The crack running through Berlin foreshadowed a wall and 4 decades of ideological confrontation. Asia's story was just as dramatic. Japan, left in ruins after the atomic bombings, fell under full control of General Douglas MacArthur's American occupation. What followed was painful but transformative. Total demilitarization and a new pacifist constitution that renounced war forever. Out of the catastrophe emerged the Japanese economic miracle, boosted by technology transfers and the strategic alliance with the U.S. during the Cold War. Japan made a stunning leap from total surrender in 1945 to the world's second-largest economy by the 1960s. On the mainland, World War II directly triggered another war, a civil one. The struggle in China, paused during the fight against Japan, flared up again. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime, exhausted and corrupt, lost the war for hearts and minds. By 1949, Mao Zedong's communists had won, declaring the People's Republic of China. That moment reshaped Asian geopolitics for half a century, creating a massive communist bloc and pushing the nationalists to Taiwan. Behind all these global shifts were millions of personal tragedies and a few quiet triumphs. Imagine Hans. He was 16 when Allied bombers firestormed Dresden in February 1945. He survived by hiding in a basement, but the flames took his entire family. When the war ended, he stood completely alone, surrounded by the wreckage of his own life. His rescue didn't come quickly. First came backbreaking labor-clearing rubble for a bowl of soup. Then, a chance. Marshall Plan funds opened jobs on construction sites. Hans, who learned to lay bricks while repairing what little remained of his home, became a mason. He helped build new neighborhoods where ashes once lay. He never became rich, but he regained dignity, a roof over his head, and a new family. His story is the story of Western Europe itself, a phoenix rising slowly, brick by brick. But to the east of him, beyond a border not yet visible, rebirth followed a very different script, one that would soon shape the world's fate for decades to come. The world that emerged from the war was doomed to face a new confrontation. The alliance of necessity, the U.S., the USSR, and the United Kingdom was already cracking before the last shots were fired. In February 1945 in Yalta, the Big Three drew a brand new map of Europe. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt carved out spheres of influence, hoping for post-war cooperation. But that cooperation was a fantasy. Just a year later in Fulton, Winston Churchill delivered a line that would define the era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. the world split into two hostile camps. Thus began the Cold War, a 40-year global standoff in which the U.S. and the USSR never fired directly at each other, but rewrote history through proxy wars, coups, and a competition to prove whose system would dominate. The foundation of this standoff was fear. Nuclear fear. The arms race didn't start in the 50s. It began on August 6, 1945, in Hiroshima. America's monopoly lasted only a short while. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb. The balance of terror was born. By 1952, the U.S. detonated the first hydrogen bomb, far more destructive. The USSR answered within months. By the peak of the arms race in the mid-1980s, the superpowers possessed more than 13,000 ready-to-launch warheads, enough to wipe out the planet several times over. The entire post-war order balanced on the edge of mutually assured destruction. Against that backdrop came the first truly global institution designed to protect this fragile peace, the United Nations. Founded in 1945 to replace the failed League of Nations, its charter opened with, "We the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." But baked into the UN was the seed of future conflicts, the veto power of its 5 permanent Security Council members. Instead of solving crises, the UN often became a stage to showcase them, a place where the ideological war was fought with diplomatic weapons. To cement the global divide, both sides built military alliances. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, emerged under U.S. leadership. In response, the USSR formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. These blocs froze Europe's borders for decades. But the real battles of the Cold War were fought far from Europe. They raged in what was then called the Third World, in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan. They were proxy wars where superpowers fought by proxy, testing new weapons and defending their spheres of influence. Millions died in these conflicts. All fallout from the bipolar world created after 1945. Meanwhile, the old colonial order collapsed. The British and French empires, drained by the war, could no longer hold on to their possessions. Decolonization surged. In 1947, India, the jewel of the British crown, gained independence. What followed was a chain reaction across Asia and Africa. By the late 1960s, more than 50 new states had appeared on the map. As historian Anthony Beaver wrote, "The Second World War dealt the empires a mortal blow. It didn't just weaken the metropoles. It gave the colonies a moral right to demand freedom and the weapons to win it." These new nations instantly became battlegrounds for influence between East and West. The rivalry soon left the planet entirely. On October 4, 1957, the world woke to a shock. The USSR had launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. That quiet beeping from orbit sent panic through the West. It wasn't just a technological leap, it was proof that Soviet rockets could carry not only satellites, but nuclear warheads anywhere on Earth. The U.S. responded with full-scale mobilization, military, scientific, and industrial. The space race had begun, the most spectacular competition of the Cold War. In 1961, the Soviets sent the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin. It looked like the U.S. was hopelessly behind, but that humiliation became the fuel for a historic push. President Kennedy's promise to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade turned into a national mission. And in July 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, a triumph for America, but one built on the fierce rivalry born from a divided, post-war world. The space race forever changed our understanding of technology, education, and the limits of human potential. All of it. The long shadow of that bipolar world that rose from the ashes of World War II. Footage captured by Allied cameramen in the spring of 1945 became more than wartime newsreels. It became a mirror in which humanity saw its most monstrous reflection. It wasn't simply horror at what was found, it was the collapse of our deepest beliefs about progress and civilization. What did these discoveries mean? That in the heart of Europe, the cradle of philosophy, music, and science, a machine for industrialized mass murder had been built, refined, and run with chilling efficiency. Behind the general footage of liberation lay details that froze the blood. These were not just barracks and barbed wire. They were the logistics of death. Train schedules delivering human beings like livestock to their killing sites. Invoices for shipments of Zyklon B ledgers, carefully recording the value of stolen gold teeth and eyeglasses. Pseudoscience as justification, entire institutes dedicated to proving racial theory. Anthropologists with calipers measuring skulls to categorize inferiority. Evil dressed in a lab coat. A split reality. Just a few miles from Auschwitz's gas chambers, life could look almost normal. Locals would later insist they knew nothing, but the smell of burning flesh, survivors testified, carried for miles. This raised a burning question, not only about perpetrators, but about silent bystanders and the limits of personal responsibility inside a totalitarian system. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the horror took a different form, but one comparable in scope. The scorched earth tactics and the hunger plan, were designed to exterminate millions of Slavic Untermenschen by starvation, clearing Lebensraum, living space, for German settlers. The siege of Leningrad, the annihilation of entire villages with their inhabitants, like Belarusian Katyn or Czech Lidis, were not tragic accidents of war. They were the intended objective. 20 million Soviet civilian deaths were not a statistic of wartime losses. They were the bill for a planned genocide. The Nuremberg trials, 1945 to 1946, were more than a courtroom proceeding. They were a painful, historic attempt to build a brand new moral and legal universe. Their groundbreaking nature showed in everything, putting an entire state on trial as a criminal conspiracy. Prosecutors didn't focus on isolated acts, but proved the existence of a coordinated plan, a conspiracy to seize power, wage aggressive war, and commit atrocities. They placed an ideology and a system in the dock, the birth of a new legal vocabulary. Terms that define modern international law were codified for the first time. Crimes against humanity, violence against civilians, and war crimes. Violations of the laws of war. Humanity finally had words for the unspeakable, the drama of victor's justice. Critics immediately pointed to double standards. What about Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki? This vulnerability didn't weaken Nuremberg. Paradoxically, it strengthened its historical weight. It wasn't pure or flawless. It was human, an imperfect but heroic attempt to build a legal barrier over the abyss. U.S. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson opened by saying, "What we are doing is not creating or applying law for this particular case. We must make our condemnation so clear and compelling that it will stand as a warning to all who plan such crimes in the future." The mission wasn't only punishment. It was building immunity for generations to come. There was a second, lesser-known but equally vital dimension. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, 1946 to 1949, of doctors, lawyers, industrialists like I.G. Farben, and Wehrmacht commanders. They revealed that the criminal wasn't only Hitler or the SS elite. It was the ordinary bureaucrat signing deportation papers, the ordinary factory director using slave labor, the ordinary doctor running inhuman experiments. Responsibility expanded to society itself. The horror of the Holocaust materialized into two foundational post-war projects, each bringing both hope and new tragedy. Project 1. The State of Israel, 1948. It was an act of historical justice and deep humanitarian necessity. For survivors of the Shoah, for whom the world had become a graveyard with no safe haven, a Jewish state was an existential answer. But the UN partition plan for Palestine was implemented with disastrous disregard for the political and demographic reality of the region. The right of one people to self-determination collided with the rights of another people already living on that land. The War of Independence, the Nakba, the mass displacement of Palestinian Arabs, and decades of conflict showed how solving one injustice can create another, long, bitter, and bloody. Israel became a refuge, a fortress, and a source of an unending geopolitical crisis. Project 2. The Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, 1948. Its author, Raphael Lemkin, gave the world not only a term but a legal shield meant to protect humanity. But the shield's fatal flaw was built in. Its enforcement depended entirely on political will and on the veto power of the UN Security Council's permanent members, whose interests often clashed in exactly the regions most at risk. The convention became a powerful moral principle, but a weak legal tool. Its history is written in painful failures: silence during the Cambodian genocide, 1975 to 1979, inaction in Rwanda, 1994, where 800,000 were slaughtered in 100 days, as the world avoided the word genocide because it would require intervention. Too often, never again has meant never again, after it already happened. To grasp a tragedy, sometimes you must look not at millions, but at one person, not only the victim, but the witness, and even the perpetrator. The victim, Anne Frank, and the banality of life. Her diary matters not for graphic horrors, there are almost none, but for the ordinary life inside extraordinary terror. Fights with her mother, jealousy of her sister, first feelings for Peter, dreams of a career. By killing Anne, the system killed normality, future, and simple human complexity. Evil becomes real when it has a name. The witness victim, Primo Levi, and the gray zone. The Italian chemist survived Auschwitz and wrote about the zona grigia, the moral fog where survival sometimes required compromises with the oppressors, where prisoners served in Sonderkommando. He rejected the simplistic split between victims and executioners, exposing unbearable choices in inhuman conditions. The perpetrator, the banality of evil. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, reporting from Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, 1961, concluded something terrifying. History's greatest crimes can be committed not by monstrous fanatics, but by ordinary men who simply don't think, who follow orders and chase promotions. Eichmann wasn't a sadist. He was a career-driven administrator of death. That insight was perhaps more frightening than the image of a raging Führer. Together, these perspectives, innocence, existential struggle, and bureaucratic complicity, reveal how the Holocaust machine functioned on a painfully human level. The long shadow of this catastrophe falls directly onto our present. Refugee crises as a permanent feature. The 12 million displaced persons of 1945 became the prototype for modern migration crises. International camps, registration systems, repatriation procedures all originated here. They led to the creation of UNHCR, 1950, and the Refugee Convention, 1951. A problem born of World War II became a chronic global condition. From Nuremberg to The Hague, the evolution of international justice. A straight line connects Nuremberg to the tribunals for Yugoslavia, 1993, Rwanda, 1994, Sierra Leone, and finally, the International Criminal Court, ICC, 2002. The ICC embodies the dream of a world without impunity for genocide and crimes against humanity. Yet its work constantly crashes against sovereignty and politics. The struggle between law and power never ended. Memory culture versus denialism. Holocaust remembrance created entire academic fields, memorial institutions. Yad Vashem, the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, education systems. Yet alongside it grew a poisonous industry of denial, pseudo-scholarly attempts to erase truth. The fight for memory has become a new front line where history, politics, and ideology collide. The conclusion of this chapter of history is tragically dual. Humanity built vast structures of memory, law, and moral lessons, and yet our capacity for organized cruelty, for dividing people into us and not us, for silent complicity, remains. The war's long shadow is our own shadow, a wound that never fully heals. We carry it as a warning and as pain that returns whenever hatred is preached, whenever someone tries again to redraw the line between human and subhuman. The question, how was this possible, is not archaeology. It is a diagnosis of our present and our future. Total war demanded total mobilization, not just of people, but of brain power. The conflict of 1939 to 1945 was the first in history where the outcome was decided not only on the battlefield, but also in laboratories and on drafting tables. It became a vast and morally horrifying experiment in state-directed science and economics. Governments turned into the main customers and sponsors of research, lifting both financial and ethical restraints. The result was a storm of innovation whose shock waves would shape the next 100 years. Look at this more closely. Before the war, many breakthrough technologies were stuck in labs or in the realm of theory. War turned them into urgent priorities. For example, radar. The idea had existed since the early 20th century, but it was the Luftwaffe threat that pushed Britain to pour massive resources into the chain-home radar network, which helped save the country in the Battle of Britain. Its side effects went far beyond radar, from microwave ovens to the transistor revolution that made modern electronics possible. Computers, the German Enigma cipher machine, and the need to crack it led to the British Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. The American ENIAC was built to calculate artillery firing tables. These computational monsters laid the foundations of cybernetics, information theory, and ultimately the entire digital world. Operations research, a brand new mathematical discipline used to optimize Atlantic convoys, bombing strategies, and material usage. After the war, its methods became the backbone of modern management, logistics, including just-in-time systems, and systems analysis in business and government. This era gave birth to a new model, the military-industrial academic complex, where the interests of generals, industrialists, and scientists fused into a tight knot. First perfected in the Manhattan Project, this model became the blueprint for post-war megaprojects, from the space race to the Human Genome Project. The post-war boom was not just about rebuilding, it was about constructing a new reality on cleared ground. Several universal drivers powered that growth. Massive pent-up demand. For 6 years, hundreds of millions of people lived with the bare minimum. No new cars, refrigerators, or houses. The world was starving for consumer goods. And once industry shifted from war production to peace, it was ready to feed that hunger. Civilian use of military technology. Lightweight aircraft alloys went into car manufacturing. Synthetic materials, like nylon, originally developed as a parachute silk substitute, flooded the textile and consumer markets. Food preservation and packaging technologies created for the Army ended up on supermarket shelves. Institutional reforms. The war shattered old cartels and monopolies, opening space for new players. In the U.S., Huge public debt didn't become a burden, but a growth engine, anchoring stability and encouraging private investment. In Europe, economic integration was born, from the European Coal and Steel Community, 1951, to the Treaty of Rome, 1957. It was a brilliant attempt to bind together the economies of former enemies, especially France and Germany, making war not only unthinkable, but economically irrational. A social revolution, the rise of the middle class at scale. The key was access to education. The American GI Bill gave 16 million veterans free higher education and subsidized mortgages. It was the largest investment in human capital in history. It created a whole generation of highly educated engineers, managers, and teachers, the backbone of post-war society. Combined with strong unions and income redistribution policies, this led to an unprecedented rise in living standards for ordinary families. For the first time in history, a factory worker could realistically afford a house, a car, college for the kids, and a yearly vacation. This was capitalism with a human face, built out of fear of another Great Depression and of communism's appeal. Two defeated countries, Germany and Japan, went on to show the most spectacular growth, becoming the era's economic miracles. West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle. Its chief architect was economics minister Ludwig Erhard. In 1948, he launched a crucial currency reform, replacing worthless Reichsmarks with the new, stable Deutsche Mark and abolishing administrative rationing, freeing up prices. On top of that came the Marshall Plan. Its psychological impact, we weren't abandoned, mattered even more than the direct financial aid. The Korean War boom, 1950 to 1953. Demand for steel and industrial equipment for the Korean conflict gave German industry a powerful boost. The social market economy doctrine, a blend of free market principles with strong social protections, pensions, health care, to soften social tensions. A wave of cheap, skilled labor, refugees from Eastern Europe and later Gastarbeiter from Southern Europe and Turkey. Japan's economic miracle. Here, a different model took shape, built on strong state planning, MITI. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry handpicked champion sectors, shipbuilding, steel, automobiles, electronics, and funneled resources into them while shielding domestic markets. The Keiretsu system. Corporate groups, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, tied together by cross-shareholding and shared banks, allowing long-term investment horizons. Lifetime employment and corporate loyalty. Workers devoted their lives to the company, and in return, the company offered stability. A focus on quality and exports. A national strategy of catch up and overtake Western standards. Both miracles proved a counterintuitive point. Military defeat and near-total destruction under the right institutions and with external support can become a launchpad for extraordinary economic leaps. Branch the 1. Physics and energy offshoot. 1. Nuclear technology. Root, the Manhattan Project. Growth, the Cold War, arms race, research into controlled thermonuclear fusion. Fruit, nuclear power plants, Obninsk, 1954. Nuclear medicine, radioisotope diagnostics, radiation therapy, radiocarbon dating and archaeology, nuclear icebreakers. Offshoot 2, rocketry and materials science. Root, the German Phi 2, research on heat shields, new alloys for jet engines. Growth, the space race, Sputnik, 1957, Gagarin, 1961, Apollo 11, 1969. Fruit, satellite communications, TV, GPS, the backbone of the internet, Teflon, originally for bomb sealing components, advanced composites, Kevlar, carbon fiber. Branch 2, computing and control offshoot. 1. Digital computers and cybernetics. Root, Colossus, ENIAC, air defense systems, cryptanalysis. Growth, the invention of the transistor, 1947, Bell Labs riding the wave of semiconductor research for radar, followed by integrated circuits. Fruit. The personal computer, the Internet, evolving from ARPANET, a decentralized network designed to survive nuclear attack, and the digital transformation of every sector. Offshoot 2. Operations research and systems analysis. Root. Optimization of convoys, logistics, and aircraft sheet cutting. Fruit. Modern logistics, FedEx, Amazon, financial modeling, project management tools, game theory in economics and political science. Branch 3. Biology and medicine. Offshoot 1. Antibiotics and mass pharmaceuticals. Root. Industrial-scale production of penicillin. Growth. The hunt for new antibiotics, advances in immunology. Fruit. Modern surgery. Complex operations without the same infection risk. Epidemic control and the entire generics industry. Offshoot 2. Psychopharmacology and trauma treatment. Root. Shock therapy. Early experiments with psychoactive substances. LSD explored as a truth serum. Large-scale experience treating war trauma. Fruit. The development of modern psychiatry, antidepressants, and antipsychotics, and the recognition of PTSD as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. The material world of the mid-20th century was literally forged in the furnace of war. Our comfort, our mobility, our interconnectedness, even our health, all carry the genetic code of technologies born for destruction. That creates a deep ethical paradox. We enjoy benefits whose roots lie in the darkest chapters of human history. The microwave that saves us time is a descendant of radar that brought down bombers. The peaceful atom lighting cities is the twin of the atom that incinerated Hiroshima. This segment has shown how catastrophe became a catalyst. But the ultimate legacy of this explosion of innovation is ambiguous. It gave us unprecedented power over nature and our own lives, and also unprecedented tools for self-annihilation and total control. We became both the architects of our own paradise and the blacksmiths of our own apocalypse, working with the same metal. That duality may be the most enduring and most unsettling legacy of that war, one we will have to live with forever. The war became both a massive social elevator and a crushing press that permanently reshaped societies. It didn't just redraw borders, it rewrote social contracts, smashed class barriers, and forced people to rethink what identity even means. The process was painful, contradictory, and it created the social dynamics we still live inside today. The gender revolution, from Rosie the Riveter to a new idea of womanhood before the war, the idea of women working heavy industrial jobs in Europe or the US was almost unthinkable. Within months, the war wiped those taboos away. The image of Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, it was daily reality for millions. The scale. By 1944, women made up 37% of the U.S. labor force, about 16 million workers. In the USSR, that number reached up to 55%. They weren't just filling in, they were running massive presses, operating cranes in shipyards, assembling complex electronics, working as chemists and analysts. The psychological shift. For the first time on a mass scale, women gained not just a paycheck, but real economic agency. They became primary breadwinners, felt their irreplaceable value to the war effort, and their self-perception and expectations from life changed for good. The real drama hit in 1945 to 46. Governments and societies, obsessed with a return to normal, expected women to quietly go back to their kitchens and hand jobs over to returning soldiers. The pressure was enormous. Propaganda glorified domesticity. Companies laid women off en masse. For many, this return was a personal disaster. Thousands filed lawsuits over discrimination, and psychological crises became widespread. This collective experience, direct discrimination after years of heroic work, became the powder keg for second-wave feminism. Betty Friedan, in The Feminine Mystique, 1963, directly linked the widespread malaise of 1950s housewives to this forced retreat into what she called a comfortable concentration camp. The fight was no longer for the right to work, that was already won, but for equal pay for equal work, real career opportunities, control over reproduction, the spread of contraception, the dismantling of everyday sexism. The war did not give women equality. It gave them an unanswerable argument and the moral right to demand it. The collapse of racial hierarchies, soldiers of freedom in chains of segregation World War II, created one of the most painful paradoxes of the 20th century. The US and the UK fought a war against Nazi racial ideology, while their own societies remained deeply segregated, and their empires still rested on colonial domination. The African American experience. Over 1.2 million Black Americans served in the U.S. military, but in segregated units, often relegated to support roles. Yet many were deployed to Europe, where, especially in Britain and France, they suddenly encountered white civilians treating them as equal allies, not second-class citizens. Future civil rights leader Medgar Evers, who served in Europe and was later murdered by a Klansman, said openly that his determination to fight for civil rights was born in the war. The slogan Double V, victory against fascism abroad and against racism at home, became a rallying cry. President Truman's 1948 executive order desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces was not a generous gesture from above, but a concession forced by veterans and the growing moral shame of the nation. It was the first major crack in the Jim Crow system and a legal precedent for the civil rights battles to come. The colonial experience. The armies of the British Empire and French colonial forces included hundreds of thousands of Sikhs, Gurkhas, Senegalese tirailleurs, Indochinese soldiers, and others. They fought and died for the freedom of their imperial masters and returned home as subjects, not citizens. They had seen with their own eyes that supposedly invincible white overlords could panic, retreat, and lose. The myth of racial superiority collapsed right in front of them. Indian nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose formed the Indian National Army, fighting alongside Japan against Britain. Others, like future Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah, remained officially loyal during the war but came back determined to fight for independence. The war did more than weaken imperial centers. It stripped colonialism of moral legitimacy in the eyes of the colonized and even of many in the metropoles themselves. Post-war culture became a vast therapy session for a traumatized civilization. It tried to answer questions that had no easy answers. How do you live after what you've seen? Who are we now? 1. Cinema. From heroic epics to existential tremors. The first post-war wave, late 1940s to 1950s, produced massive war epics like The Longest Day or The Bridge on the River Kwai. Their purpose was clear: shape a manageable, heroic memory, unite nations around a narrative of victory, and varnish trauma with patriotic glory. By the late 1950s, another tone emerged, a kind of disillusioned realism. Films like Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, 1957, didn't glorify war. They exposed cynical leadership and the senseless deaths of ordinary soldiers. At the same time, film noir, with its shadows, paranoia, femme fatales, and broken protagonists, became the visual language of a world scarred by war and deepened by the Cold War. A world of mistrust, moral ambiguity, and permanent anxiety. 2. Literature. The language of absurdity for an absurd age. A generation of veteran writers went searching for a new language. Traditional realism felt almost obscene, too neat for an experience that shattered logic itself. Their answer was absurdism and black satire. Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse-Five, 1969, used sci-fi, time jumps, and fragmented narrative to convey the feeling of total loss of control he'd known as a POW who survived the bombing of Dresden. Joseph Heller, in Catch-22, 1961, portrayed war as a deranged bureaucratic machine where sanity itself becomes proof of madness. His Catch-22, the impossibility of being discharged on mental grounds because asking to be discharged proves you're sane, became a universal formula for 20th century bureaucratic and totalitarian logic. Günter Grass, in The Tin Drum, 1959, used the perspective of a child who refuses to grow to probe moral deformity and collective guilt in German society that nurtured Nazism. 3. Mass culture and spy fever, romanticizing the Cold War. In a nuclear standoff where direct confrontation was unthinkable, war morphed into a shadow conflict of intelligence services. Pop culture wasted no time glamorizing this new front. The arrival of James Bond in 1953 says it all. Agent 007 is a fantasy of the omnipotent individual, a lone operative who, armed with gadgets and charm, can solve planetary problems while governments dither. Bond is a product of imperial nostalgia, Britain's lost grandeur, and technocratic optimism, faith in technology and cleverness. His world is one of clean lines, West versus East, civilization versus barbarism, masculine confidence versus decadent weakness. This simple binary logic was a psychological shield against the real complexity and moral grayness of the Cold War. The most enduring social consequence of the war was the rise of a distinct generation, the baby boomers, born and raised in its shadow. Their childhoods were marked by air raid stories, tales of atrocities, and either material hardship or, conversely, the new consumer abundance. Their parents were traumatized veterans or quiet women pushed back from factories into kitchens. This generation became its parents' harshest judge, youth culture as counterculture. They rejected establishment values, discipline, hierarchy, patriotism, delayed gratification, all seen as the mindset that had led the world into slaughter. Their answer was hedonism, spontaneity, and the pursuit of intense experience right now. Rock and roll, rooted in African American blues brought home and popularized by returning soldiers, became a raw, physical rebellion against respectability. Jeans and leather jackets turned into a uniform that rejected both class distinctions and military uniforms. Political radicalism. The student protests of 1968 in Paris, Berkeley, Prague, and beyond shared a common core: rejection of authoritarian logic, the logic that had fed both fascism and Stalinism. The slogan, "It is forbidden to forbid," was more than youthful provocation. It was a philosophical rejection of total control itself. The Vietnam War, seen as a direct continuation of imperial and militaristic policies, became the flashpoint. Pacifism stopped being a fringe stance and evolved into a mass movement. The sexual revolution. Its roots also trace back to the war. The mass death of young men sharpened the sense that life, pleasure, and physical love mattered now, not someday. The advent of reliable contraception, the pill, 1960, made this shift possible in practice. Rejecting double standards in sexual morality became part of the broader revolt against the hypocrisy of the older generation. 80 years later, World War II hasn't faded into history. It remains an active player in political debate and cultural life. Memory as weapon and as shield. The language and imagery of the war are constantly used to justify or oppose modern policies. On the international stage, comparing any dictator to Hitler, invoking Munich and appeasement, has become a standard rhetorical move to legitimize intervention. Claiming the mantle of fighters against Nazism remains a powerful tool of soft power and moral superiority. In domestic politics, right-wing populists often exploit nostalgia for a great nation that proved itself in war, contrasting it with today's multicultural, plural societies. Liberal forces, in turn, invoke the lessons of the war to warn against xenophobia and nationalism, Protest signs reading "Never Again" or "We remember what they did to dissenters" are direct borrowings from this historical capital. The danger of memory inflation. When a complex historical experience is flattened into cliches like good versus evil, something crucial is lost. The word fascism, when slapped onto any political opponent, gradually loses its specific horrifying meaning. That makes it harder to see how real authoritarianism actually grows, often not from cartoon villains, but from social crises, economic shocks, and the slow erosion of legal norms. The bottom line, the social and cultural consequences of World War II turned out to be deeper and more durable than its political settlements. The war acted as a brutal accelerator of modernization, force-feeding society's ideas of equality, human rights, and personal freedom. But it also created a profound trauma of distrust of grand narratives, of authority, and of the very idea of progress. Our contemporary world, with its identity struggles, minority rights movements, existential anxiety, and obsession with authenticity, is a direct product of that social earthquake that began in 1939. We don't just remember that war, we inhabit the world it built and argue with the ghosts it left behind. And how honestly and how deeply we conduct that argument will decide whether we can finally step out of its long shadow, or whether we stay there, repeating the same mistakes under new names. 8 decades later, the scars of World War II, the deep fractures, explosive innovations, and painful struggle for justice, still form the scaffolding of our reality. This hour-long journey, now coming to an end, has been an attempt to trace the long shadow cast by that colossal event. We've seen how, out of physical and moral ruins, a new world emerged. The bipolar order of the Cold War, economic miracles built on wartime technologies, and a profound social revolution that reshaped what we mean by human rights and human dignity. But history is not a museum piece. It's a living fabric, and the patterns of the past show through in today's crises with unsettling clarity. The architecture of global security built in 1945 is now being stress-tested. The United Nations, conceived as a guarantor of permanent peace, too often finds itself paralyzed, echoing the weakness of its predecessor, the League of Nations. The veto in the Security Council, meant as a brake on escalation, frequently becomes an instrument of geopolitical deadlock. We're watching large-scale warfare return to European soil that was supposed to be forever freed from the specter of total war. The language of historic lands, protecting compatriots, and denazification is a distorted echo of the 1930s, amplified by modern media. The response is no longer lightning blitzkriegs, but economic sanctions on the scale of a blockade and hybrid warfare in cyberspace. It's a conflict of a new era, rooted in an old, unresolved question. How do you guarantee the sovereignty and security of small states in the shadow of imperial ambition? The technological paradox born of the war has entered a new phase. The atomic bomb gave us 70 years of fragile nuclear peace, deterrence through fear. But the Manhattan Project and the arms race produced not just a threat, but the ethical framework to contain it. Today, we stand at the edge of a revolution with no such framework. Autonomous weapons deciding to kill without a human in the loop. Cyber attacks capable of paralyzing a country's power grid anonymously and without a declaration of war. Algorithmic propaganda and deep fakes eroding any shared sense of reality or fact. All of this is creating an environment where traditional ideas of military ethics, declarations of war, and even the concept of a combatant are dissolving. The threat no longer gathers into a single mushroom cloud. It's diffuse, omnipresent, and often invisible. Information warfare has become a battlefield that repeats one of the core lessons of the 1940s. Totalitarianism doesn't start only with tanks. It starts with language. with the destruction of any space where truth can exist. In the social sphere, the war's long shadow appears in the universalization of human rights as an ideal, and in the chronic crisis of putting that ideal into practice. The civil rights movement, second-wave feminism, decolonization, all of them drew moral strength from the anti-fascist crusade. The logic was unanswerable. If we fought racism and racial supremacy in Berlin, how can we tolerate it at home? Yet today, that consensus is fracturing. We are seeing a global rise of right-wing populism and nationalism that appeals not to universal rights, but to authentic identity, sovereignty, and border control. This is a direct reaction to post-war projects of multiculturalism and globalization, which were themselves reactions to the nationalist nightmare. History seems to move in spirals, constantly testing the strength of the post-war order. At the same time, in the digital age, the question of collective responsibility has taken on a new tone. Nuremberg rejected the excuse, "I was just following orders," and established the principle of personal guilt. Today's debates over cancel culture, reparations, and the reassessment of monuments are a continuation of that same painful work. How does a society built on a crime live with its legacy? How do you share the burden of historical guilt without falling into new forms of division and hate? And yet there is one fundamental difference in our era. The greatest threat we face, anthropogenic climate change, is not ideological. It's existential and absolutely global. Here, the lessons of World War II are not just a useful analogy, they are a practical guide. The war proved that humanity is capable of unprecedented scientific, industrial, and social mobilization in the face of a shared danger. The Manhattan Project, the overnight conversion of entire economies, all of this shows what is possible when stakes are understood as a question of survival. Today, we need that same level of mobilization for a transition to a green economy. Climate conferences are, in a way, attempts to build the equivalent of post-war institutions for a new planetary threat. And with that comes the clearest warning from the past, the policy of appeasement in the 1930s, ignoring a growing danger, hoping it will blow over, believing it can be contained, localized, or managed away. That is the straight path to catastrophe. The climate crisis is that kind of mounting threat, one that demands not appeasement, but a collective response on the scale of the anti-Hitler coalition. So what remains? Memory, but not memory as a list of dates and parades. Memory as an understanding of causes and consequences, as an awareness of how fragile civilization really is. World War II showed that the road from advanced philosophy and brilliant science to death camps and total destruction is much shorter than we'd like to think. That road is laid not by one madman, but by millions of small choices. The choice to stay silent, to look away, to say, "I'm just doing my job," to accept simple answers to complex questions. President Harry Truman, who had to make the decisions that ended the war and opened the era of Cold War confrontation, once said, "We must not be passive pawns of fate. We can and must shape history and make it. The responsibility for greatness is ours, just as the responsibility for peace is ours." In those words lies the core of it. The long shadow of World War II is not fate. It is a reminder of responsibility. Responsibility that does not rest on some abstract forces of history or states, but on each of us. On the politician making a decision, on the engineer designing a technology, on the journalist searching for the truth, on the teacher explaining history, on the voter casting a ballot, on anyone who sees in everyday life lines being drawn again between us and them, who hears language filling up with hate, who watches complexity being replaced by a single convenient enemy. The war that took 85 million lives is over, but its final chapter has not been written. We're writing it every day. The question it leaves us with is this: What will be the long shadow of our era? Will it be the shadow of a new wall, a new fear, a new wave of forgetting, or the shadow of a tree we planted together on the scorched ground of the past? The shadow of a bridge we built over the chasm of misunderstanding? The bell that rang for victory and peace in 1945 has long since fallen silent, but its echo still vibrates in the foundations of our world. Will we hear in it only triumph and mourning, or will we also hear a call to vigilance, courage, and stubborn hope? The only things that can keep the world from sliding back into that long night our grandparents fought so hard to leave behind. Thank you for being with us on this historical journey. If you'd like to keep the conversation going, hit like, subscribe, but far more importantly, leave a comment. Tell us, which legacy of World War II do you think matters most for our world today? And how do you think we're handling its long shadow? And remember, history is not what people think about us. History is what we do. See you next time in the shared space of memory and ideas.